Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Wednesday, June 26, 2019, here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University. With us today for the Center on the American Governor is Lucille Davy, who served as Commissioner of Education during the administration of New Jersey's 45th Governor, John Corzine. Lucille, welcome to Eagleton.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
I know you grew up in Livingston, New Jersey.
Yes.
I know you went to Seton Hall where you majored in mathematics, and you got a law degree from Notre Dame. On your Twitter feed, you describe yourself as an education policy wonk, mathematician, mom, and grandmother. How did you go from being a mathematician with a law degree to being an education policy wonk?
It's a really interesting question, and it really happened by accident, frankly. Our two little boys at the time in the early to mid-90s were in elementary school in Westfield. I was practicing law part-time at the time, and there were policy decisions being made at the state level around administrative costs that were beginning to impact the school district that our boys were attending. And I began to get involved as a parent, very, very active parent, and started learning about policy and about the policy that at least in our district they felt was negatively impacting their ability to deliver high quality education. And at the time, I think the focus was on limiting administrative costs at the district level. Mm-hmm. So they were requiring districts to cut back on their spending, which meant losing curriculum experts in reading and mathematics and science and music, et cetera. And frankly, because I was active and involved, I was hearing a lot of this and I was concerned about it. And my husband at the time was working for then Mayor Jim McGreevey in Woodbridge. And as I'm sure you know, he ran for governor in 1997, unsuccessfully that year, mm-hmm. but continued to pursue it and ran again in 2001. And after the 97 election, I went, we knew him socially because my husband worked with him. And I went to talk to him, one day, and I said, if you're gonna run for governor, you really ought to have some education policy. You ought to have a game plan because, what happens at the state level can really mess up what's going on in local districts.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. And I told him the story about what was going on with administrative costs, and I think he was aware of that because he'd run and he'd heard people complain.
And he'd been in the state legislature.
And he'd been in the legislature, and interestingly, he'd also had a master's in education from Harvard. So he had some education policy background too. He certainly had knowledge about policy.
Did he not have other education advisors on his staff or on his campaign at that point?
At the time, in 97, right after he ran, the first time he ran, I think it was, he didn't even, I think, expect necessarily to win the primary.
Well, everybody expected Rob Andrews, the congressman from South Jersey, to win that primary.
Exactly. So he won. I don't think that it was a kind of a short time frame to get into a general election. Of course, Governor Whitman was a popular governor. It was a tough election campaign, although he came fairly close.
It was closer than expected.
Absolutely, because I think he had some really good messages.
Were you involved in that campaign?
Minimally, very minimally. My husband, because he was the business administrator in Woodbridge, was not. He was, there kind of holding the fort down at the town, in Woodbridge. And I was giving the governor or the candidate some advice on education policy, but really not a lot. There wasn't a lot of time for that at that point. It was, he really won the primary in June, early June, I guess, and the general election was that fall. So. Right. Did a little bit, did some volunteering, but that was about it. But right after, I did go to him and say, I'd like to help you. I'd like to work with you on this. And one thing led to another, and I actually organized a group of educators with whom he met on a regular basis throughout, I guess, 1999 and 2000 in preparation for the run in 01.
Now, how did you? Who were these were these local Westfield people whom you knew, or was this a wider universe of
It was
experts?
actually statewide. Because of my education background, I am a certified teacher, and I became certified while I was an undergraduate, and had been active. My dad was on the Board of Education in Livingston at the time, and he was active at the state level with other school board folks. And my dad had been a teacher for many years. He had been a college professor, so I had a lot of links to education.
Did you actually teach at any point?
I taught after my senior year of college. I was certified at that point. I taught in the summer school in Livingston with actually with some of my former teachers, which was really a lot of fun. I taught at the college level. I taught when I was in law school at Notre Dame. I taught at St. Mary's College in the math department. And then when I first came out and was practicing law before I had our first son, I taught at Mercer County Community College in the math program in the evening. And that was an interesting conversation, by the way, to have with the partners in the law firm when I said I want to teach, and they thought I was going to go and teach business law or something else. And I said, no, I'm going to teach mathematics. And it was a little different, but it was my background, and I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed being a teacher. I probably would have been a teacher if my father hadn't said to me, teachers don't make a decent living. And of course, in the 50s and 60s, teachers weren't paid very much. It really took Governor Kane, I think, to put teachers, to recognize that they should be paid as professionals, because they were professionals, and to, elevate the minimum salary and really change things. But he said to me, it's good to be certified. You never know when you might want to use that certificate to teach somewhere. He said, but you should have another avenue as well. And that was really why I went to law school. But there was always this teacher inside me.
Were you practicing law throughout this period that we're talking about in the 70s?
I was part-time, not full-time. I was practicing law throughout the 90s, once our boys went to school full-time.
In private practice or with a firm?
I was with he was a sole practitioner in town, and I basically just did part-time work for him.
Town being Westfield?
Yes, in Westfield.
Okay.
He was the Westfield Township attorney. And in my prior years of practice in the 80s, I did a lot of municipal work. And so I had a really strong background in municipal law, and went to work for him on a part-time basis. There was a big zoning case. I remember that's how I first approached him. There was a huge zoning case going on that the town had turned down some development, and they needed to defend that action. And of course that comes to the municipal attorney to defend. And so I went to him and said, hey, I could help you. Our children had just gone to school full time. I'd been out of the practice for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years. And I said, I've got some time. I'd be happy to help you work on this case. And he was grateful to have the help. And because I had some experience, because I had done zoning appeals before, I knew how to handle that. He was delighted to have the assistance. So I began working on that. And
Did you win the case?
We did win, absolutely. I had a good track record as a municipal attorney.
Now was any of this, your husband's position at Woodbridge, your position with a municipal attorney, was any of this political, or was this purely professional in terms of?
They were all professional.
Okay.
My husband had always been a professional manager.
So you were not actively involved politically?
We were not. Absolutely not. And interestingly, just for a quick side story, when he went to Woodbridge, Jim McGreevey had called him right after he was elected mayor the first time. I think that was in 1992. And he had called my husband and wanted him to come to interview. My husband had a really good reputation as a town manager. And Jim said, no, I'm not interested. I don't do political. I'm a professional
And McGreevey
manager.
at the time was not only, he had just been elected mayor, but he was also, was he an assemblyman or a senator? He was in the legislature as well, and was a dual office holder.
He
and
was.
Clearly had political ambitions.
He clearly did. And my husband turned him down, and he had some other people reach out to Jim and say, you should really talk to this guy. He wants a professional administrator. He doesn't want a political person. He wants someone who can do what a good town administrator is supposed to do. And so he eventually said yes and went to work for him. The role that I had in the municipal field, of course, municipal attorneys get appointed by elected officials, but in the communities that we served, it was mostly councils that were mixed, Democrat and Republican, and we weren't selected because of the party affiliation. The attorney that I went to work for had been the Westfield Township attorney for many, many years. I'm assuming he was connected politically in some way, but I certainly didn't work for him on a political basis.
Right.
So yes, when I went to then candidate McGreevy, or I guess he had been unsuccessful in '97, shortly after that, when I went to him to offer to help him on education policy, it wasn't from a political perspective. It really was about good policy, because I was concerned our boys were in school, and I was worried about the impact that bad policy decisions might have on their educational opportunities, as well as the opportunities of other children. I never fought just for our children alone. I always fought for all kids, because I thought they all deserved great educational opportunities.
So in 2001, McGreevy runs again, and this time he wins. And he appoints your husband, who has been the business administrator, to be the chief of management and operations in the governor's office.
Yes.
At the same time, you are appointed as a education policy advisor, I guess you'd call it, in the office of the chief counsel to the governor. Would that be an accurate
The title that I had was special counsel for education. It was a unique role. I think probably other governors along the way may have had someone like that, but it was different in that I was focused on education, because as we led up to that campaign in 2001, we had developed an education policy platform from preschool right through higher education. I had worked on the whole gamut, and I had met with people in the education community, with Jim then as a candidate. We developed policy papers. We had a whole game plan for what we would do if he became governor in education. And so I went into the council's office and had a really unique role. There were policy people, there were folks that worked in the council's office on legislation. I did not do that. There was someone else who looked at the education legislation. I would work with them, but I was focused on implementing this policy plan.
Why from the council's office? Why not from policy and planning, for example, where that would normally take place?
It was, first of all, the policy and planning office wasn't exactly the way I guess it has been in some administrations. But the other thing was my husband was involved in that, and I couldn't be working under my husband. It wouldn't have been appropriate. But I did have a different role, and in the council's office, it was a place. I guess I could have been in either place. There wasn't a lot of the policy and planning office at the time wasn't as robust. In some of the other areas, I think, in education, because of the way the governor had made that a priority and really had this very, very definite plan, real goals and objectives and very specific policy initiatives that he wanted to implement.
And why, or no, I shouldn't say why, I should say, what kind of relationship did you have working out of the council's office with the folks who were at the Department of Education?
Very close relationship. In fact, the person who became the commissioner actually came out of that group of advisors that I had organized, who met with then candidate McGreevy over a 2 to 2.5 year period.
And who was that?
That was Bill Abrera.
Oh, right, okay.
He was among the individuals. There were about, I think, 18 folks that I had brought together. There were several superintendents, there were some principals, and there were some teachers. So it was a mix of folks from the education community.
Now, frequently, when there is an expert in a particular subject area in the governor's office or the council's office or policy and planning, and a whole department out there that's focused on the subject area, there is conflict, natural conflict, over who really speaks for the governor and who has the governor's back, or whose back does the governor have when it comes to settling any kinds of disputes. Did you have any of those kinds of situations occur between your position and the Department of Education, or was it all smooth sailing?
It was smooth sailing because we had developed this education plan together. Bill Abrera, who was the commissioner, had been involved in that. And so it was the governor, the commissioner, and I, we were all on the same page. We were all working towards the same goals. And what I was able to do was I had the governor's ear, and I had the ability inside the governor's office to move some things. If anything, I think it gave the Department of Ed a little bit of an advantage, because all the other departments, didn't have someone like me who could advocate for them, go to the governor directly. It was a unique opportunity. But there was this very, very, wide-ranging policy set of objectives. And so there was a lot to be done. The governor had been talking about the funding formula. He'd been talking about early childhood. He'd been talking about teacher preparation. He'd been talking about standards and assessments. He'd been talking about accountability. He'd been talking about the integration of higher ed with K-12, more closely working together, better preparation of teachers. So there was a lot to do. And because the commissioner had been part of that group, he helped develop this blueprint of what the plan was.
How much of that required legislation, and how much legislation was actually introduced during the, 2 years or 2+ years of the McGreevey administration?
So not a lot of it required legislation. Some of it required funding, which came through the budget. So we did need legislative support. The work on the formula that started, didn't happen until actually Governor Corzine was in office. But that work began during McGreevey's years. It was really difficult because the formula, as you know, had been struck down multiple times by the Supreme Court. So there was a little bit of work on that, but we had a very, very statewide early learning focus on really focusing on improving pre-K standards, making sure that there were opportunities, there was funding. We had an early literacy initiative where we funded reading coaches that went into school districts throughout the state to help support improving early literacy outcomes because we understood the importance of children learning to read before they got to 3rd grade. The research was pretty clear that if they weren't strong readers by 3rd grade, it was going to be much more difficult to help them become strong readers. And after 3rd grade, children are really expected to read for learning purposes. And so it was important to ensure that from pre-K to 3, you were helping all children become strong readers.
And you got legislative appropriations to do this.
We got, I think the first year there was $10 million appropriated just for reading coaches. And we had a program where we identified districts. We put them in the districts that needed the help the most. So we were looking at outcomes. Where were the districts where it looked like children were having difficulty? Where could we support districts that might not have the local funding that would be required to help them address this? We also put in place, a plan, an early literacy development plan, and we had professional development opportunities. We actually, were fortunate enough to have Dorothy Strickland, who was a professor at Rutgers at the Graduate School of Education, who was a nationally recognized expert. She had worked for presidents from Democrat and Republican administrations. She was really highly respected, and she was right here in our own backyard. And so we tapped her, and she led the effort. She was a national early literacy expert, so we were so fortunate to be able to work with her. And she led an effort to develop really a blueprint for early literacy that districts could utilize as they were implementing early literacy programs in their districts. And there was professional development offered. This reading coach initiative was just one part of that.
Were these programs specifically geared toward districts with large numbers of students who needed extra assistance, or was it statewide?
It was statewide, but because the funding was limited to some extent, we certainly looked at the districts that appeared to be most in need. So the ones where there were more students who weren't performing at grade level. And we prioritized those districts.
And
but
were
it
those
went
primarily
across the state.
The Abbot districts?
It was not the Abbot districts, because the Abbot districts had their own resources. At that time, the court decisions required that the Abbot districts be given whatever resources they said they needed. And so we focused them on early literacy and wanted them to make sure they were making investments in early literacy.
But the
they
funding
had
for this
the
program
resources.
was going.
The extra funding went to those non-Abbot districts, which were districts that had kind of suffered as a result of not having a formula to implement for so many years.
Right.
A lot of the money was going to the Abbot districts because of the court orders.
For people who are either watching this or reading the transcript of it who are either not from New Jersey or have not been living in New Jersey for the last 30 or 40 years and don't know what Abbot districts are. We'll get to that in a minute when we talk about the whole thorough and efficient system of public education in the state constitution. But before we get there, let's get back a little bit to your biography, which with Governor McGreevy's resignation and the reins of the governorship going to acting Governor Dick Cody, he appointed you as the acting commissioner of education. How did that come about?
It was very interesting, and again, quite accidental. I was in the governor's office, still in that role as special counsel, when he took office. I think it was in December or the fall of 2004.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I think he took that, maybe that September or October or something at some point, because I remember we talked to him. Jim and I were actually both in the car going to visit our son, who was...
Are we talking Jim McGreevy or Jim, your husband?
No, my husband. Jim, my husband Jim and I were driving up to Massachusetts to visit our son, who was in a summer program at one of the hospitals in Massachusetts. And we were driving up there, and actually Pete Camerano, who was at the time the chief of staff, I guess, he'd been running the Senate office, and for governor, for then, I guess he was then Senate President Cody. But we talked to him, and we talked to the governor, actually, Governor Cody, as well. And they asked us both of us to stay on. Jim was at Human Services at the time, and I was in the governor's office. And so he said, would you stay on? And we were obviously delighted to do that. I was really happy to do that because we were in the middle of a lot of work, and there had been a lot of time and effort put into it. So, I was delighted to have the chance to keep that going forward. So I remained in there and really had the same role. Governor Cody, interestingly, his wife is a teacher, or was a teacher at the time. She may be retired now, I'm not sure. But she was a teacher, and so he knew about what was going on in schools. And he had some very specific things that he wanted to focus on. It was the issue around testing, the way the state tests were being administered. Teachers were not happy. The tests were being given at the end of February, the first week of March, and they were supposed to be testing a child's knowledge from the full year of school. And yet, if you give the test at the end of February, you're basically about 2/3 of the way through the year. You still have several months of school to go, but you're asking children to show that they've learned everything for the whole year by the end of February. So there's that. He was concerned about school funding because, of course, he was a legislator, and he had constituents in his district, and he knew that there were, there's real inequity coming out of the fact that without having a formula to distribute the money, there were the Abbot districts, by court order, were getting the funding they needed. And most of the other funding was happening, first of all, very minimally. There wasn't a lot of extra money to pass out to every other district, but also it was done by Band-Aids. So they would, a legislator would say, well, there's not enough money going to this, so I want to isolate some funds and we'll give it to this. And then only a certain number of districts would qualify. So if you had a legislator that had some pull, or had some leverage over the state budget, they might be able to put a Band-Aid on here or there, but it wasn't getting funding out in an equitable way.
And I imagine that Senator Cody, representing the district that he did, had some municipalities that were benefiting from Abbott money, and others that were not, because his district in the Oranges has, East Orange, which I'm sure is a receiving
that
district,
was an Abbott, yep.
And West Orange, which is an affluent area. So
well, although West Orange at the time, with a really changing population, as was happening in many places throughout the state, which was the reason why I think it really became an imperative to begin to look at funding. Because as communities that bordered and rimmed a lot of the Abbott districts were changing, and as some of the Abbotts were changing, a place like Hoboken, for example, that was attracting a lot of young professionals who couldn't afford rent in New York City, so they would live in Hoboken and take the train or a ferry over to the city. They were becoming much more affluent. Jersey City was changing, the waterfront was changing. Some of the Abbott districts in the Ocean County area, Monmouth County area, Long Branch, Asbury Park, their populations were changing and they were becoming wealthier. So the inequity.
And there were some inner suburbs that at the same time were beginning to decline. And
you had suburbs that were beginning to serve student populations that were harder to serve because either the children came from families where English wasn't the first language, maybe English wasn't even spoken at home, or they were lower income families.
Right.
And those children, as we knew from the Abbot decisions, those children need more resources, they need more support.
And also those districts, because the tax base was declining, were
Exactly.
less able to raise the money through local property taxes to pay for public education. And that really is the basis of the entire structure that the Supreme Court has been talking about all these years. But wait a minute, let's get back.
Yes.
Before we get there.
Okay, so I was in the governor's office. I'm still working for Cody. He had some things he wanted me to focus on, and I did. I continued to do the policy work. In the middle of the summer, the commissioner, I guess, gave his notice that he was going to be leaving at the end of August. And then I guess she was the chief of management operations, Diane Legreedy, called me into her office.
She had succeeded your
replaced my
husband, who
yes.
was now the Commissioner of Human Services.
Yes.
Okay.
So she called me into her office and she said, the governor wants to send you over there to DOE. And I just looked at her like, what? And she said, no, he wants you to go over there. When Librera leaves, he wants you to go take over. And I said, I can't do that. I'm not qualified to do that. I'm not prepared to do that. And she said, what do you mean? No one knows more about the policy work and what we're trying to achieve than you do. And she said, he wants to talk to you. So I said, oh, okay. So, we scheduled a time. I went in to meet with him. And, I told him also I didn't really think I was equipped for the job. And he said, you most certainly are equipped for the job. And he gave me, 3 priorities. One was testing, one was the formula, and I can't remember what the third one was. But there were 3 things he said to me, go over there and get these 3 things straightened out. Oh, I know, it was the QSAC, the Quality Single Accountability Continuum, which he had been pushing because that was the plan was that the state needed an exit strategy out of those state takeover districts, which at the time, Newark, Jersey City, and Paterson were all in state takeover. And, he didn't think, it was just taking too long. None of these districts were able to get themselves out from under it. And he didn't think that the department had focused enough on coming up with a plan for how you would evaluate whether or not the districts were able to begin to regain some local control. One of the problems was that in the past, the theory had always been you don't give them back local control until student achievement reaches 80% of students proficient. And that was a really high bar.
That's a high bar, yeah.
And it's also not the only thing you look at to tell if the district is improving and functioning better. So while I was in the governor's office working with the department, we had been working on what they called QSAC, the Quality Single Accountability Continuum, QSAC. And that was a way of evaluating districts on a continuous improvement basis, looking at 5 different areas. One was around student achievement, but one was on personnel, one was on governance, one was on finance, and one was on sort of the more administrative, other programming kind of areas, special education, things like that. And so Governor Cody asked me to go fix the testing. The state was about to award a $70 million contract to basically continue the testing that was the same kind of testing that we had been doing. And he didn't want that. He wanted me to really try to go do a better job on that. He wanted me to focus on the formula. He was getting a lot of pressure from his colleagues in the legislature because he was serving as the acting governor, but he was also still the Senate president. And so they wanted some action on that area. He wanted me to go over and kind of keep that moving. I mean, work was being done, but it wasn't, he wanted to make sure that we kept moving the ball down the field. And then the QSAC issue, regulations and kind of a game plan needed to be completed. So I went over.
You learned that you don't say no to the governor.
You don't say no,
even if he's
certainly,
the acting governor.
Ever. You never say no to the governor. And, I said, okay, I'll do it. He really seemed to have tremendous confidence in my ability to go over there and do that. The advantage that I had, I think, and I don't know that I realized this back then, I had been working closely with the department and with the staff. And I was, they trusted me. And they knew that I was about good education. I was focused on good education policy. I wasn't going to come over there and, fire people and change the game plan and turn the place upside down. I was going over there to help them continue to do the good work that they were doing. And so I was really welcomed by the senior staff.
I presume that your reason for thinking that you weren't qualified to do this is because you had no administrative experience to run a department. Was that your basic concern?
It was that I had no administrative experience to run a department, but also I had never been a principal or a school superintendent. I mean, in retrospect, I know now that that's not required. I really think that I actually had the skill set that served the best, and that was I understood good policy. I was steeped in the research. I knew what research said worked, what research said didn't work, and I had a wonderful network, not just within the state, but I had built up a national network of resources.
Did you find that administration was difficult, or because of the fact that you were respected for your policy wonkishness, that sort of came naturally? Or were there people in the department who handled the administrative side competently that would allow you to continue to focus on policy?
That was the good fortune. I actually had a group of the senior team, so I had a deputy commissioner and then 6 assistant commissioners. And I kept most of the people who had been in place, I kept them there. 2 of them left, the finance person and the person doing the standards, curriculum and standards. But I elevated people who were in the department who had been lifetime department staff who really knew their stuff. And I guess in many cases, people don't have opportunities to move up like that because commissioners often bring people into the top tier senior staff positions. I didn't have time to do that. I went over there the first week of September, I think, or second week of September. And I was really planning to be there until January 17th or whatever of 2006. I had no expectation that I was going to be able to stay and actually serve then a full term as commissioner.
Now there was a period there where your husband was serving as the Commissioner of Human Services. You were serving as the acting Commissioner of Education.
Yes.
The only husband and wife team in New Jersey history, the first. I'm not sure if there have been since then, but I don't recall if there have been or not. You were certainly the first husband and wife team to serve simultaneously in a governor's cabinet. Did that cause any difficulties for you? Any problems? Were there any situations where you had a cabinet meeting where you and your husband disagreed about something, or
No,
you had to gang up on other members of the cabinet?
It's interesting, but he was at Human Services and he had his hands full.
Oh yeah.
At that time, they were really working to change the whole child welfare system, and I, had my hands full at DOE because the governor had said, go do these things, go work on these things. So we basically, the biggest problem was not enough of us at home with 2 teenagers. We were fortunate; they were good students and really good kids. But if anything, it was that we didn't spend enough time with them during that time period. We both worked really long hours, each in our own way. And it's interesting because the cabinet, I don't think there was ever, at least in the time that I served, I never sensed that kind of cabinet competition, even in Governor Corzine's term. I never sensed that. I always, and maybe it was because I was always focused on what I was doing and not really worried about anything else, but I never sensed, people were trying to get one leg up on somebody else.
Yeah. So, 2005 election, by this time, your husband, Jim, is returning to the private, well, he's actually entering the private sector. He's setting up his own consulting company. He's leaving government. You're staying on, and you stay on as acting Commissioner of Education. At what point did the Corzine transition team let you know that you were going to continue in that capacity?
So
Was it like most situations, the Sunday before the Tuesday of the election? They
No,
call you up and say, yeah, you're going to,
It
would you
was-
like to stay there, please?
it was right after New Year's, I think. I received a call from, I think it was Heather Howard. She was the governor's chief policy counselor. And she said that he wanted to talk to me. So I went and met with him. I think
Did you know him at all? Had you ever met him?
I had not met him. I had been advising off time, on my own time. I had been giving some advice to folks who were working on education policy for him. I mean, that was to some extent selfish because I was keenly aware that the states that had made the most progress in terms of improving student outcomes and really helping all children to be prepared for post-secondary work and college, et cetera. The states that had been most successful were the ones that had sustained leadership and sustained policy focus. I think Massachusetts comes to mind, for example. They catapulted to the top of the country because in the early 90s, they set some very strong goals, and the commissioner served, I think, almost 2 decades through Republican and Democrat governors. And they really made a big difference. And so I understood that if everything that we worked so hard on for 4 years was going to be left by the wayside, that was going to mean that we weren't going to make the kind of progress that I had hoped we would. And certainly that I had invested a lot of my time and energy into helping make happen. So I had been giving them some advice. And Governor Corzine was a huge supporter of early childhood. And he had been when he was in the U.S. Senate. He was an incredible supporter. He understood the importance of early childhood education. He understood why that was the best investment you could make to help children succeed when they get to K-12 and beyond. And so that was already a big priority for him. It was also a priority, in the McGreevey and Cody years. So, that was a good thing. But I wanted them to know what we were doing on the formula. He was obviously interested in the formula because, again, everybody throughout the state was saying this has to be fixed. School funding can't be given out in a piecemeal basis. There needs to be more equity. And these districts that are really suffering because they don't have the tax base to provide high-quality educational experiences need help. The state needs to step up and fulfill its constitutional obligation. So I gave them a little bit of advice, hoping that they would have kind of the same priority from a focus perspective. I went to meet with him. It was an evening during the first week of January, I think it was. And he said to me that he'd heard really good things about the work that I was doing, but that he had already committed to doing a national search for a commissioner. And I said, I understood that. He said, well, I hope you'll stay on. I hope you'll put your name in to the search process. He said, keep doing, he wanted to know what we were doing, and I told him where we were and what the status was of the things we were working on. He said, keep doing what you're doing. He was pleased to know that we were working on the formula because he knew that had to be a priority. And so I stayed on. I put my name in the mix, and I think sometime in July, I guess, I emerged as the successful candidate. And, interestingly, I didn't skip a beat from the day he was sworn in. I never acted like an acting commissioner, even though I never knew how many days I had. I acted like the commissioner because I felt like I had to. I had this deep feeling inside that I was working on behalf of the state's children. And so that was my goal. And for however many days I was going to be there, I was going to give it 150% to make sure I did whatever I could to improve their opportunities in education. So even though that was this almost 6 months, I guess, it was almost 6 months to the day, I think, from January to July, we just kept pushing ahead and we kept working on the initiatives. We moved CUSAC along and we were working on the formula in earnest. And really working with legislators. There were folks in the legislature at the time. The late Senator John Adler was a huge proponent of getting the formula done and getting it right. Senator Barbara Bono, huge proponent of focusing on it and getting it done. There were some folks in the Assembly the same way. I mean, there were a core group of legislators who really said, no matter what else you do, we have to get this done and we have to do it right. So I was named, I guess, or he nominated me in July. I wasn't sworn in until October.
Well, and it's interesting because the Governor Corzine's first budget, which he introduced in, I think, February or March of 2006, called for $2 billion in spending cuts and eliminating 1,000 state jobs. Every commissioner of every department was ordered to come up with a list of program cuts or places where money could be saved. You're the acting commissioner at the time. How did that affect your department? How did you function as acting commissioner, having to go through the department's budget and either lay people off or cut programs or cut money from your budget?
Well, we did have to cut back on some programs. The real challenge was from the perspective of personnel, because we couldn't hire people.
Because there was a hiring freeze.
I had created a math and science office, and we were really trying to focus on elevating mathematics, because we understood that in the 21st century, knowing how to read is not sufficient. Children have to be numerically proficient as well, and they have to be critical thinkers and mathematics. And jobs in New Jersey, given the pharmaceutical industry and a lot of the other industries, really required students that had more science, technology, mathematics skills.
This is STEM, right?
STEM,
Basically?
exactly.
Yeah.
Before STEM became as popular
Right.
as it is. And we also knew that districts were struggling because student math achievement was flat. We weren't getting the kind of improvement that we needed. And we also knew that there were lots of children that were having difficulty on the high school test, which was frankly a fairly low bar. It was, mid-year Algebra 1 was all we were asking.
Was this the HSPT, or had that already been? I can never keep up with all the acronyms of the different statewide tests that have come along.
Well, the HSPT was the first. That was the first high-stakes high school test. At that point, it had become the HSPA, which was High School Proficiency Assessment, but almost the same test, still with a relatively low bar. We were actually asked to participate with a group of, I think it was 8 or 9 states, where Achieve, a think tank in DC, looked at the tests, looked at the items, analyzed the test, your high school exit test, or your high school exam, analyzed the items, and then analyzed what it took to be deemed proficient for your graduation exit. And we actually stacked up pretty well among the other states, but it was still determined to be a relatively low bar. And they were the ones who concluded that children could leave high school having passed the high school proficiency assessment with about the middle of the Algebra 1 year of knowledge, despite the fact that for many years, from the 90s at least, the state standards required that children master even parts of Algebra 2 and geometry to graduate. I mean, that was in the high school standards, but the high school test was never measuring those standards. So one of the things we were transitioning to, and this was with Governor Corzine's support, was moving to end of course exams, where children would take an Algebra 1 test at the end of their algebra course so that they would know for sure whether or not they had mastered algebra. We had a test that we worked on with other states for Algebra 2 and for geometry, an end of course exam. And we actually knew that we had to focus on that. We had to improve mathematics achievement, that as I said, literacy wasn't enough of a focus. You had to be balanced in both areas.
Were you able to fill the position of the science and
We had
mathematics?
one person. Our goal was to have more math specialists that we could then send out to help districts. We were never able to do that. I did have one person because we had gotten her on board before the hiring.
Well, in the next budget, every cabinet officer was ordered the cabinet officers were ordered to create plans to cut $3 billion in the budget. And the final budget adopted cut another 2,100 jobs. So you're under the gun. By this time, you are the commissioner, not the acting commissioner, but you're under the gun again to reduce costs and to reduce staff. How did that affect your ability to to do what you felt the department needed to do?
Well, again, it was really difficult to hire people. You had to go and get special permission to fill a slot. And there were a few occasions where we lost someone who couldn't be replaced by advancing someone within the department. We had to, go out to find someone. So that was a problem. But the other thing I should point out, that most of the Department of Education's budget was school funding money that was going out. Our budget, compared to most of the other departments, was relatively modest.
The actual operating budget of the department.
We had a relatively small staff compared to many of the other departments. So our operating budget was minimal. We didn't get impacted the way some of the other departments did, where they actually had to reduce staff or not fill positions. We didn't fill positions. When we lost people through attrition or retirements, we didn't get to fill most of those positions. But we didn't have that many to start with.
How large was the department at the time?
I think we had about 800.
Yeah, it's small.
It was relatively small, and many of those people were in county offices as well. All those people counted. We had people that worked on special education. So we had people in the state school for the deaf was within our department. So those people were counted within that. The nucleus down in our offices in Trenton on Riverview, we were a minimal staff, candidly. It was difficult because there were a lot of places where I wanted to beef up the staff. I wanted to bring more help in, and we couldn't, and that made it difficult. But because most of the money went out for school funding, there weren't any cuts to school funding. There were no increases. But my recollection is there weren't any cuts.
But, okay, I want to move on to April 2007, when Governor Corzine was nearly killed in an automobile accident that had him out of commission for several weeks. We've talked to a lot of people, both from the governor's office and from the cabinet, about not only their personal reactions to that, but how it affected their ability to do their job during his absence. How did it affect you?
Well, it obviously shakes you up to know that something like that's happened to the governor. I think many of us got to see him when he first came home, which was reassuring. There was a lot of good communication from the governor's office about his well-being, because we were all obviously concerned about that. Again, I have to be candid. I was laser focused on some really difficult work. We had a lot of initiatives that we were trying to move forward, and I knew he was counting on me to deliver. And so my theory was, while he's recovering, we need to make sure that we're delivering on what he expects of us from the department. One of the things I don't think I mentioned was we had tried at the end of 2006 to move ahead with a formula. We had really been working hard on it. And I remember sitting with him and with Heather in a meeting to talk about where we were. I think it was early to mid-December. It was just before the holidays, because the guillotine kind of came down for the budget in February. So you had to be ready. If we couldn't get a formula done and passed through the legislature in time to be able to run those numbers for school aid numbers as part of his budget address, it was going to be impossible. We'd have to wait another whole year.
Right.
So we were really working hard to try to get it to a point where we could move it to the legislature. We had been working with legislators. We had done, focus groups with people trying to help them understand what we were trying to accomplish with the formula. But candidly, it wasn't really quite ready. I thought we could try. I wasn't sure we could convince enough legislators to vote for it. We sat down with Governor Corzine, and he wanted us to be candid with him, and we were. Heather was working closely with us on this. We were working with the Attorney General's office as well, because we knew it was going to go to the court eventually, Supreme Court, for a ruling. And it really, I think the governor said to me, "It sounds to me like you're really not quite ready." And in my heart, I knew he was right. I was disappointed because I felt like I was letting him down, because I knew how much he wanted to do that sooner rather than later. But
he also must have recognized how complicated this was.
He did, and he said, it's been 30 plus years. People have put forth formulas. They haven't been upheld. So if we take another year to get it right and to do the work that we need to do to convince folks that this is the right formula, he said, let's do that. So we at that point regrouped and said, okay, and then had a game plan to get this done during 2007. So that, I think, is where the accident sort of impacted us a little bit, because while we were moving ahead, there was a lot of upheaval around everything that was happening. Right. So it wasn't as easy to, certainly weren't able to communicate with him where we were going. His staff, though, Heather, was just wonderful, phenomenal. She was a huge supporter and a huge asset to us. I liken her, by the way, during my tenure to the way I was in the governor's office for the department. And she was the head of policy overall, but I think she had a real soft spot for education. And I think the governor did. And so, she worked really closely with us to help us move this thing along. We did a series of meetings with legislators. We did a series of community meetings. We held a whole group of hearings throughout the state to try to go through each of the areas that we were, I guess, impacting. And when I say impacting, I mean, we were changing the way special education was funded. We wanted to make sure people understood what the impact would be on that. We were looking at how transportation was funded. So we had a meeting about transportation. We were looking and changing and moving to a weighted formula where children who were low income would get extra resources, but we had expectations for what school districts would do with that. So we were meeting with people to explain all these different pieces of the formula. And then in the fall, we began meeting with the legislature with the committees to talk about what we were doing. The bill was written. It actually, I think, was finished in early December. In the interim, we also brought in experts from around the country. We wanted to make sure that we were addressing the needs of children at risk adequately. So we brought in some experts who knew best how to serve children who came from low-income families or who came from families where English wasn't the first language. And we were really calling upon them to review our work and to help us see, was there something we were missing? The other balance that we were trying to strike was we were doing a weighted formula, so children get extra money based on what grade they're in, what special needs they might have. We were changing special education from a kind of a per pupil, you tell us how many special ed students you have, to a percentage basis. And it was one of the ways that states had successfully funded special education. So we brought in some folks that understood different ways to fund special ed to make sure that we were on the right track there. One of the reasons why, and you may know that today there's a lot of talk about the way special ed is being funded in the funding formula, because they're back to actually using our formula again, which is great to know. But there's a concern because people are saying not every district has 12% special ed students, and that's basically what we did. We set a percentage of students. We said this many students on average would need special education services, and then we funded them based on a percentage as opposed to the number of pupils. We did that for a very simple reason. Up until that time, before a formula was in place, the only way to get extra money was to tell the state you had children who were special ed classified, because the state funded special education separately. And so districts had an incentive to just classify students. And we saw districts that had 30% of their children classified. Well, they did that because they needed the resources, and we understood that. But we didn't want them classifying students just to get them extra money. Right. We felt strongly that the formula, if it provided the resources fairly across the board, that the formula would distribute what needed to be for all children. They didn't have to be classified special ed. They would get those extra resources anyway. They wouldn't have to have that, that title to get special needs, special ed funding.
Let's talk a little bit about the history of this 800-pound gorilla that we're talking about, the funding formula. I'm old enough to remember Robinson versus Cahill, the very first of the challenges to the system of funding public education. Based on the notion, or based on the constitutional provision in the New Jersey Constitution, that the state provide for a thorough and efficient system of public education.
Right.
The Robinson versus Cahill led to something called the Botter decision, which said that the current funding based almost exclusively on property taxes was unconstitutional.
Right.
And ordered the state to come up with a funding formula that would satisfy that thorough and efficient clause. Every effort to do so failed. The next one was Abbot versus Burke, and that's why we talk about the Abbot districts. Again, saying that the formula that the state had come up with, there were several formulas that the state had come up with, all failed to equalize or lessen the imbalance
Right.
Between property-rich school districts and property-poor ones, and that the state had a responsibility to step into the breach. When you're working on this formula, what is the status of the current formula? Is it under review by the Supreme Court? Has it been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court? And you're working to find a new one? What kind of a gun are you under from the courts?
Well, it had been declared unconstitutional in the late 90s, and that was when the court ordered the Abbot remedies. And so there was a specific list of programs and services, including early childhood. In the late 90s, that was when the court said that 3- and 4-year-old children in Abbot districts needed to be in early childhood programs. That happened late in Governor Whitman's second term, not long before she left to go to the federal government. So one of the things that we did when I came in under Governor McGreevey was really focus on enrolling children, getting those programs up to speed in the Abbot districts. That was one that was court ordered. And a lot of people said, well, how could it be court ordered? It's the Constitution said ages 5 to 16. How can 3- and 4-year-olds be covered? But the court said in Abbot that in order to give those children a chance at a thorough and efficient education, there had to be early childhood opportunities. Mm-hmm. And they'd been waiting for the state to turn around and do the right thing, and the state just, for whatever reason, fits and starts, never got it right.
Well, I think in fairness, the legislature was never able to get the number of votes necessary to approve a formula that could stand constitutional muster. You had too many districts that were winners and too many other districts that were losers, and to get the consensus that you needed in both the Assembly and the Senate, you ended up having to come up with a formula that was almost doomed to failure.
Right. Yeah, and I guess they put some things forward that they could get the votes for, and the court always said, this isn't adequate.
Exactly.
So we use those experts to help us make sure that we had put the right pieces together. And our goal always was equity, both in terms of the distribution of resources and equity in terms of what the local district is expected to contribute. So our belief was that the property wealth, regardless of what it was, that you should give the same percentage of your property wealth towards your schools. So we wanted all districts to contribute something. Under the Abbot decisions, which, in the 90s when the last formula was thrown out and the court basically said, the Abbots get A, B, C, D, E, F, G and fund this. That really meant that most of the money had to go to fund those programs, because the districts would say to the Department of Ed, here's what we need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So write us a check. Mm-hmm. And the state had to come up with the money because they had no other way to respond. The department never had the capacity to evaluate. Those were some of the largest districts in the state. Many of them had probably more employees in the front office than we had working on this. Certainly.
And at least 3 of them were under state
Three of them were under state takeover. That's another whole story for another time, what takeover really meant, and whether or not that worked. But in any case, the districts, we wanted to make sure that everybody had skin in the game. We wanted all local taxpayers to give a fair share, and it was built that way. At the same time, then, we wanted to make sure that you didn't get penalized based upon the profile of your student population. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a certain base amount of funding for an elementary school student. We knew that it cost a little more to educate a middle school student, and we had done this with educators around the table to say what is required to give a middle school child an education that allows them to master the state's core curriculum content standards, which include, by the way, world languages, music, and the arts, and your basic subjects, science, math, social studies, English, literacy, et cetera, writing, phys ed, health education. So we looked at what would it cost to educate a middle school student to those core curriculum standards. And that was more than an elementary school student, in part because in middle schools, oftentimes you have teachers who specialize in their content area. Kids move around and have different teachers. There are more opportunities in music for children, et cetera. Similarly, in high school, more electives, more specialized coursework, more teachers oftentimes, and greater resources required. There was an add-on for children who went to vocational schools, because we understood that in a vocational school where children are getting some specialized training in a certain skill area, maybe they needed special equipment. For kids who were in an automotive program, for example, as cars were becoming more tech-oriented, and you weren't just lifting the hood, but you're plugging into a computer to diagnose what was going on, they needed more equipment. So the children in vocational schools got an extra add-on. There was extra money for children who were low income, because oftentimes those children didn't have the opportunities at home to help support their education, whether it was summer opportunities, things like that. There was more money for children where English wasn't the first language, because it was understood that those children in school were going to need to learn English besides learning in English. Right. They needed to master English language. And so all those weights were added to the profile of the students in the district. And we felt that was the most equitable way to ensure that no matter what population the district was serving, they would get adequate resources.
So what you were basically trying to do at this point, it seems to me, is that you were looking at what the court had ordered in the absence of a suitable remedy from the legislature, and saying, we think we can do better. We want to change essentially the formula that the court had dictated in the late 90s and substitute it with this brand new one and hope that the court will say okay to that. Is that basically what you were doing?
I think so, but two other things. The first is that at that point, the Abbot districts, many of them were receiving from the state in excess of $20,000 per pupil in funding. That was more than twice what most districts in the state were spending. It was more than twice what most children around the country were having spent on them, regardless of where they lived. And also the other thing that we learned as we were doing this work was that almost half of the children who were free and reduced lunch eligible, so poor children, were living outside of Abbot district boundaries. And in many cases, they were concentrated in districts that were not classified as Abbots. They weren't getting any of these resources. And yet they were educating a population of children who looked very similar. I mean, it seemed completely unfair to me that by the nature of geography, for example, where the Trenton and Ewing boundary is, that children who lived on one side of the street in Trenton got all these extra resources, and a poor child who lived across the street in Ewing got none of them. That just was patently unfair to me. And once we knew that the Abbot districts were getting adequate resources, we really concluded that the conversation had to stop being how much more money do they need. It had to be how do they use these resources well, that the department had to step up and really help them do a better job of delivering education with the resources they had. And then making sure that there were equitable resources for all these other children who were living all over the state in many other districts. I mean, there were lots of districts that had a pretty significant concentration of children. And by the way, in many of those places, the local tax levy was also through the roof. So besides not having the resources from the state, they were raising and asking their taxpayers, in many cases who were not high-income people, they were middle and lower-income people, asking them to give a greater portion of their resources to fund their children's education. So it was just gross inequities across the board. And something really had to be done to make sure that we could distribute equitably. We did look at a lot of what the court ordered. So, the idea of early childhood, we built early childhood into the formula. And that was a question, frankly. We went to the governor and we said, we want to include early childhood for every low-income, free and reduced lunch eligible child in New Jersey, because we don't think you should only receive it if you're poor and you live in Abbot districts. And he agreed. And so we built that in. That was, I think at the time, that was unheard of in the country. The idea that a funding formula would require we were requiring the delivery of early childhood, and we were going to fund it 100% in through the formula. Now, of course, the history now shows us that once Governor Corzine left office, focus on early childhood really went by the wayside for a while, and the impetus to provide the money for that expansion was really minimal. We started the expansion. There were several districts that stepped up right away because they knew that the population of their children could really benefit. They had seen what was going on in the Abbot districts, and this had been studied. There were folks around the country looking at what were the early childhood impacts of kids when they got to the upper elementary school grades. But we had our own evidence here because by this point in time, children in some of the Abbot districts had been in high quality pre-K and they were reaching grades 3 and 4, and we had test results and we could say we saw the difference when children had those opportunities for early childhood. And so we knew that they really paid big rewards and big benefits for the children.
At the end of 2007, you had come up with a new school funding formula.
Yes.
It did away with Abbott. It apportioned money based on enrollment with special weight given to students from low-income households.
Right.
That bill squeaked through the lame duck legislature at the beginning of 2008, and at the end of 2008, it was rejected by the Supreme Court. But
no, it wasn't rejected.
Well, here's maybe I've got this wrong, but here's, as I understand it, it was rejected by the Supreme Court, but turned over to a special master, who then gave it provisional approval, and the Supreme Court subsequently reversed itself with the proviso that the formula be reviewed after 3 years. Is that, do I have that wrong?
I don't think the court rejected it. I think the court said, we don't have the wherewithal in a hearing with the Attorney General and a couple of attorneys to determine whether or not this is an adequate formula. We want testimony. And that's when they appointed the judge up in Bergen County, whose name is right now escaping me.
But he was the special master to.
It was Judge Doyne. He was the special master in Bergen County. He was assigned to the case, and he took testimony. So we had to present our case. We had to justify. So it's almost like going back to a lower court. I think what the Supreme Court said was, we're not at this level going to say, yes, this formula looks good. They weren't prepared to make that decision at that point.
Okay.
We went before Judge Doyne, and I think I didn't go every day, but many of my staff did. Drove from Trenton to Bergen County for almost a month because we presented witnesses and we presented experts. We explained the entire formula. Our folks were questioned. Our experts were questioned. The Law Center, unfortunately at that time didn't see the wisdom of the formula.
The Law Center being the
Education Law Center,
which had brought the original suit in Robinson versus Cahill and Abbott versus Burke.
Yes. The Law Center was challenging us,
right,
and said that there were parts of the formula that were not adequate, that they were not constitutional. And they were arguing to a large extent, in my mind, for a continuation of this sort of bifurcated system, Abbots and non-Abbots. And it really was time to move away from that. I think we convinced the court that not only was that not a fair system, that it wasn't serving many, many children, poor kids particularly, but also that what we had put forth was constitutional. We proved to Judge Doyne that we were providing the resources that would be adequate to deliver the core curriculum content standards to children in every district, regardless of their own personal individual educational needs, that our formula was constitutional. Now, built into the formula was supposed to be reviewed every 3 years.
Right.
That wasn't the court order. That was in the law. And candidly, we weren't around long enough to do that for the first time. I think Governor Corzine funded it in the 08-09 school year, because it was adopted in January of 2008. So it went into the budget for the fiscal year 09, which was the September 08 to June 09. And then it was funded again the following year, despite the fact that that was the year the bottom fell out nationally with a recession. But we did get money from the federal government at that time that helped us maintain that.
$890 million
We did,
in federal
and it helped us
fund.
maintain the work that we had done. But the
And
court...
that money actually went into funding the formula?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. But the court, after we were before Judge Doyne, then we had to go, he wrote a special master's report. And then we had to go back before the Supreme Court. I remember the governor going there with us. And Ann Milgram, who was then the Attorney General, argued the case on behalf of the state.
Before Stu Rabner, who had been her predecessor as the
Although,
Attorney
interestingly,
General.
he had to recuse himself.
No.
He did. Because in 2006, he was the chief counsel. He'd been the chief counsel, and then he became the Attorney General,
Right.
if I remember right. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure he was the chief counsel for a
Okay.
brief period of time, and then he became the AG. Either that or he was the AG directly. In either case, he had been involved tangentially with the work we were doing in '06, which was not the way the formula actually came out. In my mind, especially as a lawyer, I didn't really think he even knew anything about what we were putting forth. But in an abundance of caution, he recused himself. So it was not before him,
Oh,
but
okay.
it was before the other justices. And we convinced the court that the formula that we had put forth was constitutional and would deliver a thorough and efficient education, would allow for that delivery to every child in the state.
What's happened to it since?
I'm sorry?
What's happened to the formula since?
Well, I think after Governor Corzine left office, I don't think Governor Christie thought the formula was right. I don't think he thought it was the right formula to use or whatever. Despite my efforts to try to go to other people who might be able to convince him to just look at it, because honestly, an objective, and I know it, you probably think I can't be objective, but I mean objectively, this thing couldn't have been more vanilla. It was fair in every respect. It gave no advantage to anyone. It was based on the students you served. Nobody got extra because somebody, liked the superintendent, or somebody had a legislator who had more clout in the Senate or the Assembly, or somebody was the budget chairman. It wasn't like that. It was completely devoid of any of that. It was just fair and equitable and applied to everyone the same way. And so I had hoped that people would be able to explain that. I don't know that he ever really got his arms around it. To some extent, and this happens, I think, it's not just here in New Jersey, but governors come in and they think if it's something my predecessor did, it probably isn't good, I should change it, especially if they're from a different party. And so for whatever reason, they didn't fund the formula. And then they started doing the Band-Aid approach, which is the worst thing. That's where, whoever squeaks the loudest gets more money. And, somebody demands, I want more money or I won't vote for this, or somebody, and that's what was going on before we did the formula. And then, of course, the Law Center, when they stopped funding it, went back to court. And the court said, well, if you're not going to fund the formula, then you have to keep funding the Abbots the way the Abbots need funding. And so then they just went back to where we were before the law was implemented. To his credit, Governor Murphy, I think, recognized that the formula was something that they ought to be looking at again. I know that Senate President Sweeney, who I'm pretty sure voted for it, and in the Assembly, I don't think that the Assembly Speaker was in the Legislature at the time. I don't think Craig Coughlin was there. But I know Lou Greenwald, who's the budget chair, or was the budget chair, is still there. Those folks understood that this made sense. And so the Legislature has been pushing. And they're actually running the formula again now. There is no question that the formula needs some changes, including, I would agree, to special education, because the reason that we did that percentage funding was because we were trying to accommodate and account for these high numbers of children who are classified overclassification that just was done for different reasons. And that's not the case anymore. Once you get adequate resources in the system, you don't need to. You should really fund special education children based on the number of children you're serving. Some districts become magnets for children with certain disabilities because they get a reputation for serving those children well. Well, they shouldn't get penalized for serving kids well.
But how do you do that and at the same time prevent the phenomenon of districts overclassifying in order to get more money?
Well, because I think, number one, you still have some oversight of that. You wouldn't just leave it to their design, but they're getting extra funding for children with other needs. So, you don't need to. I think what I'm talking about is children with disabilities, things like autism, where children, the earlier you get intervention for them, the better their educational outcomes are. There were some districts that started some really incredible in-house programs, and parents with young children moved to those communities because they knew there was great opportunities for their kids to be served well. You don't want to penalize them for that. Right. So I think you have to have oversight, and you got to keep an eye on it. But I think saying that flat out everybody just has 11% of their children who can be classified is not the right way to do it either.
One of the things that happened late in the Corzine administration was a school construction bill providing $3.9 billion to repair or rebuild schools across the state. Was that under the rubric or the bailiwick of the Department of Ed, or there was a school construction program that was separate? But how involved was the Department of Education in that initiative?
So we were involved to the extent that the districts told us what their needs were. So they all had to file school construction plans and long-term plans, 5 years, 10 years, et cetera, what their needs would be. And of course, when the court ordered in the late 90s those Abbot remedies, one of the remedies was money for school construction. So $6.2 billion for the Abbots and 2.6 or 7 for non-Abbots was appropriated back in 2001, I believe, before McGreevy took office. But our responsibility was to look at what the district's needs were, what they needed in terms of repairing facilities, what they needed in terms of replacing them, what they needed to meet student population growth. In the Abbots, in many cases, it was to replace crumbling, dilapidated schools. I remember visiting schools with Governor Corzine, and the two of us just saying, we were shocked that children were in facilities like that. It was horrifying. But the needs were significant because, candidly, districts had let the facilities go. They had not kept up with the repairs that should have been made over time. And as you know, if you've got a leak and you don't fix it, the leak gets bigger, and then it starts to impact bigger and bigger parts of the facility. And then before you know it, now you need to rebuild half the building or something. So there were tremendous needs. We helped determine the priorities. So we set forth parameters for how you would judge and evaluate, which school gets top priority for funding, because the money was limited, but also the resources of, kind of watching the process of bidding and reviewing plans and all that. Even those resources were limited. We couldn't just build 300 schools at one time. It needed to be done in an orderly fashion.
So your agency was responsible for prioritizing those programs?
We helped prioritize. We helped determine where they were needed. And in some cases, people would say, we need 28 classrooms. And our folks would say, we think you can do it with 24. So we did some of that too to help to really look at the educational need. We knew what they had to deliver educationally, what kind of program. And our folks, because they had education backgrounds, knew whether or not what they were presenting was reasonable and legitimate or not. And then we would turn that over to the school construction. At that time, I think it was called the SDA, Schools Development Authority. And then they would take it from there. But we did sort of the lead-up work, the prep work, to get them to a point where they were ready to then go out to have the building done.
For most of your commissionership, you had to deal on the federal level with No Child Left Behind. And then I guess for the latter part, you had to deal with the race to the top. How did these federal initiatives affect your day-to-day operations at the State Department of Education?
So our federal funding was oftentimes tied to those federal initiatives and being able to prove to the feds that you were delivering what they were expecting you to do. In the case of No Child Left Behind, that was sort of right up my alley. It was about leaving no child behind, making sure all children got educational opportunities. Well, that's what I was all about. And that's what the department was focused on. The game plan that McGreevy came in with in education was to give all children a high quality education, to help support teachers, to make sure our standards were high standards and that we could actually deliver and children could succeed in meeting those standards. So No Child Left Behind kind of fit with our policy objectives. One of the challenges was that No Child Left Behind also required that you test every child in grades 3 through 8 in English language arts and mathematics, and then once at the elementary level and once at the middle school level in science. And then you had to test all high school students once in English language arts, mathematics, and science. At the time, the state had been using a 4th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade tests. That was it. So we basically had to add grades 3, 5, 6, and 7. That was more than double the testing that we were doing. So that was a huge budgetary issue. That was one of the challenges I faced when I went to the department under then acting Governor Cody, because the feds, so that was 2005, the feds had been turning up the heat on the testing. The NCLB came into play in 2001, and they gave you some time to get all those tests in place. So we moved pretty quickly and got a 3rd and a 4th grade test. Well, we had a 4th grade test, we got a 3rd and 4th grade test that kind of went together. And then we had the 8th grade test, and then we had the high school test. But we had been, to some degree, a little recalcitrant about getting grades 5, 6, and 7. Tests are really, really, really expensive. In fact, the bulk of the department's budget that didn't go out for school funding went for testing. And the feds basically said, we're not going to give you whatever small amount we got from the feds. It wasn't that much, but it was still money, so we couldn't turn it down. But you had to do the testing to get the money. So when I went over to the department in September of 2005, a bid had come in for the testing for grades 3 through 8, and that was the one that was $70 million for 5 years. And that was a lot of money. It was way more money than we had in the budget. And it wasn't going to fix the problems with the testing that Governor Cody and I had really prioritized, and that was testing later in the year and getting results to the schools faster. I don't think we talked about it earlier, but the test results, used to reach the schools either in the summer or sometimes in the fall.
Jeez.
So
Like
you
6
gave
months
this
after.
test in February or early March, and you don't get the results, and then how does a teacher use that to help a child do better? I mean, to me, it was just a total waste of money because you got no benefit from it. You did it because the Fed said you had to, but you weren't getting any educational benefit. So we wanted to make sure that we got some educational bang for that investment, bang for the buck. So we actually rejected this $70 million bid, or we got multiple bids, but I think the lowest one was $70 million. We rejected the bids. And we said we're going to start from scratch again. I had to go to the feds. And again, I was acting commissioner because it was 2005. I had to go to the feds, and basically I remember meeting with Margaret Spelling's team. She was the then U.S. Secretary of Education. And I had to explain to them why we couldn't deliver a grade 5, 6, and 7 test that spring, because the cutoff for doing it was 2006. We were supposed to deliver it by then. And basically what they said to me was, well, you have to give a test. You can recalibrate and rebid and try to reform your testing system, but in the meantime, you have to give a test. So I got them to agree to let us use an off-the-shelf test that was not necessarily totally aligned with our standards, because your test was supposed to be aligned to your state standards. And they agreed to let us do that if we could find something that was relatively close, and we did. We found something that was fairly close. In the meantime, I organized an assessment work group. And so
Is
we
there a
brought
whole
in,
retail store out there of off-the-shelf tests?
testing became well, it had always been a cottage industry of sorts, because school districts for years tested students. It just wasn't done as publicly. I think NCLB forced districts to, NCLB forced districts to make those results public and to print them in the newspaper. I don't know if you remember back when the Star Ledger would do an entire special section that would go school by school,
Right.
district by district, of all the results from all the grade levels that were being tested on an annual basis. Those results would be made public. So that was, shining a light on it really changed it. There had always been tests, though. Our children took the Iowa Test of Basic Skills.
I remember that.
In the 90s, there was the Stanford 9 test. There were a couple other ones. I think districts had always tested students to see how they were doing, probably for placement purposes, maybe determining whether students needed special help in class if they weren't doing well. It was sort of an objective measure that was different than what you were getting from a classroom assessment.
Right.
And it's important, I think, to have an objective measure like that. By the way, I'm a big fan of those kinds of tests because I think objective measures where everybody's measured by the same bar really tells you how well students are doing. It's too easy to hide children who are not doing well if you're just giving a local test or a teacher's giving a test that he or she creates in the classroom. It was one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about going to end of course assessments at the high school level, because when we were looking at the high school proficiency assessment, we had a lot of children, particularly in Abbot districts, who couldn't pass the high school test. And after Achieve had done that evaluation of our test and basically said, you need about the mid-year of algebra to pass it and maybe early 10th grade language arts skills to pass. I couldn't understand why we had so many children who were not passing it, who were taking it at the end of 11th grade. Those children should have mastered algebra, and they certainly should have had high school English skills if we're actually teaching them. And one of the things I said to my staff was, let's find out what kind of courses are these children taking in mathematics. Maybe they're not taking algebra in high school, and that's why they can't pass this high school test that covers algebra. And to my utter shock, frankly, it turned out that children were taking algebra. They were taking geometry, and many of them, almost 70% of them, were taking algebra 2, and they were passing those classes. So they were being told at their school level, in their classroom, you mastered this content. But then they couldn't pass our high school test that was measuring algebra 1. So something was wrong. There was a real disconnect. And I thought the only way to be honest about that was to give a test at the end of the coursework so that the parent would know my child either got the algebra or he or she did not.
And what did you learn? That it was grade inflation?
I think that we didn't drill down to figure out what the real issue was. I can only assume that children were being passed along, just move through the system. If they're coming to class and they're handing in some homework, we're passing them. And that wasn't doing those children any favors, because if you let a child think that they're leaving high school with high school skills and they go into the workforce or they go to college, then they're told at that point you don't have high school skills. And that's not fair to them. They should be told that while they're in high school, while they can still do something about it. Yeah. You probably know there was a huge issue around remediation in our community colleges. And again, not unique to New Jersey, across the entire country. It was one of the things I had worked on while I was doing education policy in the governor's office. We had some community colleges where 70 and 80% of the entering students needed to take remedial coursework.
You must have found that particularly when you were teaching math at that level. Right?
Well, it was interesting because I taught back in the 80s. It wasn't as bad, and I was actually teaching a more advanced math class. I wasn't teaching the entry-level courses. But these were children who weren't even qualified to go into entry-level courses. They were taking an entry-level placement test. And that placement test was showing that they didn't have these basic arithmetic skills. In some cases, they didn't even have middle school math skills. And so, that problem needed to be solved and addressed at the high school level. And my theory was the best way to do that is to be honest about how children are performing. That's uncomfortable for people, especially if you're the high school math teacher and you got children who didn't master what they needed to, the fundamentals. And again, not a problem unique to New Jersey. This is a national problem. There are kids throughout this country who are not learning the mathematics fundamentals that they need to succeed in upper level mathematics. And as a country, we can't stand for that because we won't survive given the economic impacts that it has, to have a workforce with so many people who don't have really basic math skills. I'm not saying everybody has to be able to do algebra 2. Just because I was a math major doesn't mean everybody else has to be. But I believe all children can do that. I came from a house where I was told oh, we're not good at math. That was the mantra in my family. You know, my mom lost her father when she was in high school, and she went off of her college prep track into a secretarial track so she could help support her family. Her mom worked, but she didn't have a lot of skills. Her mother really had minimal skills, and she had younger brothers and sisters. And you know, my dad went to college on the GI Bill. He had been in the Army, but he was a history major and an English minor, and he became a special education teacher. And you know, I remember I was the oldest, and I would go for help because, for whatever reason, and it might have been because I was a musician, I had started piano lessons at a very young age, and people say that music helps develop math skills.
Absolutely.
But I had particular math aptitude that I guess was identified when I was in elementary school. And when I was in middle school, I was put in this advanced math program. And you know, when I would ask for help at home on my homework, nobody could help me. And my dad would literally say, you know, we're not that good at math. It's okay. You know, I was a history major, and you know, that wasn't helping me. But anyway, I had great teachers. I was so fortunate in the Livingston Public Schools to have just outstanding teachers. And those teachers helped me learn mathematics as well as anybody else learned it. And so my theory was that with really good teaching, any child can do it, because I did it. It's possible. Mm-hmm. And when I taught, and I think I told you, I taught in the summer school one summer. I did some substitute teaching at one point. When I taught even at the college level, I had students who said to me, I can't do math. And then I helped them find out that they could do math. And I believed that with the right teaching, with people who understood how to teach it different ways, because not all children learn it one way. And I think the advantage that I had too is having majored in math, that by the time I went to teach algebra, I understood algebra really, really, really well, because I could do things that were much, much harder. So all the algebra made sense. I probably couldn't have done that, you know, right out of high school or even right out of college. But as the years passed, I had a lot of math. I had a lot of math built up, and so I really feel strongly that all children can do these, you know, can do these difficult math problems. They can learn mathematics, so they can have choices. They don't have to say, oh, I'm not good at math, so I'll pick a field where I don't have to do any mathematics. Lots of kids say that. And there's no reason for people to say that. It should be accessible to everybody. So, you know, having an objective measure is one of the things. And by the way, Governor Corzine was brave about this, because these were not popular policies necessarily with the school community. Frankly, there was some pushback. We got pushback from the Education Law Center, who was supposed to be representing children in Abbot districts. You know, they said to me, if you make these standards, this will hurt kids. And I said, how can this hurt children? This can't hurt them. This will ensure that they get the skills they need when they leave high school to succeed in college and beyond.
I would have thought that teachers would have been more of a difficult sell on this, because their performance is being judged by how well their students do.
Well, we were not tying teacher performance. That came after me. Mm-hmm. I, by the way, would not have led with that because it's not fair to say to a teacher, particularly in the upper grades, you're basically responsible for what everybody before you did. You take the child where they start. My theory always was we wanted progress. We wanted to know that children were advancing, especially if they came in behind. So if you had a child in the 7th grade who was reading at a 3rd grade level and you got that child to 6th grade level, you should be considered a success, not a failure. And yet if you make the measure, does a child read proficiently at 7th grade level, you'd say the teacher failed. I don't think that's fair. Yeah. So you know, you have to put all the pieces in place and really support teachers. And that's the other thing, by the way. Our education certification system never required that elementary teachers learn mathematics or learn how to teach elementary mathematics. We never required that. Most of them took that because most of them had to take some methods class that included mathematics. But we never made sure that elementary teachers really understood the underlying mathematics. The example I always love to use is, you know, when you divide fractions. The trick we learned was flip and multiply, right? Mm-hmm. If you're going to divide 3/4 by a half, just flip a half. 3/4 times 2, and you get 6/4. Very simple. That doesn't help a teacher explain it to a child who doesn't understand the math behind it. And by the way, it's easy to say to do that when it's just a simple fraction, but when you have some complicated equation with variables in it, like 1 over x divided by x squared plus 3 over 2, it's a little bit more difficult. And if you don't understand the underlying mathematics, it's hard to apply it when the math gets much more challenging. So one of the things that I worked on, and Governor Corzine was a supporter of this, I began to work with colleagues around the country, other states. We came together in 2008 to begin to create standards together. We said it shouldn't matter whether you live in Massachusetts, New Jersey, Alabama, California, Minnesota, or Texas. If you're in 3rd grade, you should learn the same mathematics. We have a mobile population. Families don't stay in one place for a child's entire K-12 schooling career. So we ought to have some common expectations. We ought to have.
Wasn't that in fact what No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top were supposed to accomplish?
Race to the Top came after we began this effort. So the commissioners around the country, a group of us, got together and said, let's work on these standards together and let's work on tests together, because New Jersey was spending $50-some million on tests. Pennsylvania was spending $50 million on tests. Maryland was. We all said, why are we all spending $50 million? We're all basically creating tests. And by the way, I think the vendors were oftentimes using the same items, but charging us to create our tests. We said, why don't we do this together? We could do it better. We could release the items, because you have to be really careful. You don't want the items out in the public domain, and yet you don't want the test to be a secret. You want teachers to know it's not supposed to be a trick so that nobody knows what are we going to ask students to show us they can do. It's not a game. It's really measuring what did they learn so that you can take that information and improve their opportunity for the following year.
But then you have teachers complaining the fact that all they're doing is teaching to the test.
And the whole point of that, because we got that argument, is that if the test is aligned to what teachers are supposed to be teaching, then that shouldn't be an issue. In fairness to teachers, and this was another thing that I learned when we began to look at the tests weren't necessarily aligned. So the mathematics standards in New Jersey were separated into 4 different areas. And at each grade level, there were different standards that fell into it. One was numbers and operations, one was algebra, one was data, and one was, I think, patterns or something. I may have the 4th one incorrect now. It's been a while. But there were 4 different areas. And the standards were not equally divided among the 4 areas. The standards, particularly in the elementary grades, were concentrated in numbers and operations, where children were learning addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, early fraction work. A lot of their focus in those grades was on numbers and operations. When we went to look at the tests that we were administering in grades 3 and 4, it turned out that the test people hadn't talked to the standards people. And so the test was made up so that all 4 areas had an equal number of questions. So you weren't really testing most of the standards in the numbers and operations, and yet you were placing this crazy emphasis on data or algebra or geometry that wasn't a big emphasis in the elementary grades. And that was why teachers said, I have to teach to the test. I can't teach the standards because the test isn't aligned to the standards. It wasn't until the deputy commissioner and I sat, I remember this, in my office, looking at copies of the test that we realized that our alignment was so off. And so when we did the new testing, the grade 3 through 8 testing, which was the ESPA test, the Elementary School Proficiency Assessment, we looked to make sure that the balance of emphasis on the test matched the emphasis. I didn't want teachers to think that we wanted them to do anything other than teach the curriculum standards. It's not fair to have them try to guess what they're supposed to be teaching. It's not fair to children to measure them on something that they didn't learn. That was the other issue with giving a test in the middle of the year. There had to be some things kids hadn't learned yet. Teachers would tell me, I have to stop and teach to the test starting in January. And I would say, what are you talking about? They say, well, I have to teach to the test starting in January because the test is given at the end of February. And it wasn't until I started thinking about what they were saying. They didn't mean teach to the test. They meant teach January through June. between January and February. They had to teach everything else that was in the core curriculum standards for the year in that 2-month period. Otherwise, the children were going to get a test and they were going to see items for things they hadn't learned. And that's not fair to them. Plus, people were looking at how teachers were doing based on results and things like that. So, testing was an area that all the states were struggling with. And, frankly, we really felt like teachers should have more involvement in creating the tests. We wanted the items to look more like what teachers thought children should be able to do.
And did you succeed in doing that?
We did. There were 2 consortia of states, and this came out of Race to the Top, because money came from the feds to these 2 consortia. One was called the Partnership for the Assessment of Core Curriculum Standards, PARC or something, and the other one was called Smarter Balanced. And there were 2 groups. They were actually both taking off in 2010 when I left the position. New Jersey actually joined one of them. They joined PARC. And I think to this day continue to give the PARC in some format, although I think Governor Murphy promised to get rid of PARC. But PARC was actually a really good test for the first time. Instead of leaving it to test vendors to create, they brought teachers in with funding to create the tests. And they field tested them with real teachers, with real students. It was a really nice way to create tests. The real problem occurred when the states were encouraged, again under Race to the Top, to begin to hold teachers accountable for student performance and to have that impact their pay and their evaluation. I think that happened too soon. We were raising the bar for what we wanted kids to be able to do. We were raising the bar for what we were expecting of teachers. And I think it was too early to say, and by the way, your job is also on the line. Mm-hmm. We frankly, in mathematics particularly, we're saying to teachers, it's not enough to teach children how to do a problem from memorizing the steps. Children have to understand why they're taking those steps. So teaching for understanding is a lot different than just teaching for rote, repetitive, reproducing an answer. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the skills sheets that we used to have when we were in school. The teacher would do a few problems on the board, and then you'd do a worksheet at home at night. You do 40 problems that look just like the one that was on the board. Well, that's not enough. You want children to be able to take what they learned and be able to look at a problem they've never seen before and say, what do I know that I can use that will help me solve that problem?
Critical thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
those are the skills that the 21st century workforce demands of them.
Absolutely.
It's what colleges expect of them. It's what employers expect of them. So, those are all really important skills. Mm-hmm. I think Governor Corzine was so good about letting me participate in these national initiatives that gave us the opportunity to learn from other people who had been doing good work too. You weren't doing this all on your own. When we came together and did the standards together and the assessments together, it was, I think, the best thing for this nation. Unfortunately, it got all wrapped up into politics, and there were states that said this is the federal government forcing curriculum. It wasn't curriculum. They were expectations of what children should learn. Children should be able to read and identify the main character and the theme of a story at the end of 3rd grade. Nobody said, and you have to use this book to do it, or you have to do it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It was, they need to be able to identify the lead character and the theme. Get there any way that you want. Use any materials you want. But it got tied up, and it was unfortunate.
Yeah. One other major subject area of controversy in the field of education that I'd like to ask you your views about is school choice. Mm-hmm. What took place during your tenure as Education Commissioner in the area of school choice, either promoting it or administering the choices available to districts in terms of school choice?
So there were 2 basic programs when I was the commissioner. The first was the charter schools, which had been done by legislation in the 90s. There were a few charter schools, mostly in the cities, when I came into the governor's office in 2002. They were taking hold. There was money, there were resources coming from it, but you really needed facilities, and there wasn't extra money for facilities, so it wasn't the easiest thing to do. But certainly in the Abbot districts, as the resources were increasing, they were getting 90% of the local resources, so they were getting a fair amount of funding for children. We had a system of evaluating applications for the charter schools. There was a whole process that they went through because you were not only evaluating, could they deliver on the core curriculum standards, you wanted to make sure they were fiscally sound, that the facilities were adequate, that there was leadership and governance in place that would allow the school to operate, well and to serve children. One of the things that we looked at was accountability, because even though parents were choosing to send children to charter schools in the cities, some of them weren't serving kids very well. In fact, some of them had outcomes that were worse than the local district. I understood why parents wanted the choice. In some cases, these schools were not safe. In some cases, the schools were not led by a principal who had control of the building. In some cases, the parent thought the child wasn't being educated. And as a parent who advocated for her own kids that way, I wanted that for everybody's children. So I understood why those options needed to be available. At the same time for me, though, my theory always was that not every child in an Abbot or urban district can go to a charter school. And so it's great to help the charter schools thrive, but we have to figure out how do we support the regular public schools who are serving all the other children. I remember visiting while I was working on the McGreevy campaign. I remember visiting a charter school and talking with a principal of a charter school up in Essex County. And he said to me, we have two huge advantages over all the other schools in the district. He was a former district principal, and he was now the principal of the charter school. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, number one, every child who comes to our school has a parent who said, I want my child to go to this school. I will check the homework. I will come to PTA meetings. I'll be here for teacher conferences. He said, that's number one. He said, number two, when the child starts here, no matter where the family moves in the city, the child can stay here. We don't have school district boundaries. He said, those are two huge advantages. He then went on to explain to me that in his regular public school, from September through June, the turnover in a classroom could be as much as 60%. So from the day you start to the day you finish, 60% of the kids who started might not be sitting in your room. You might have 60% of those kids who came in at some other point during the year. Think about the challenge that presents to a teacher. I mean, it was mind-boggling to me. The parent piece was one, of course, that I fully understood because I was a suburban parent who was very, very active, probably more than my kids wanted me to be. I was very tuned in on what was going on.
Were you a helicopter mom?
I was not. I actually was not. My children would probably tell you, and they're grown now, but they would probably tell you that the best thing that ever happened was when I went back to work full time, because when I did, I had less time to dabble in what was going on. Although I will admit that at the middle school level particularly, we were in Westfield at the time, high performing, suburban district. Lots of very interested, engaged parents. I will admit that it shocked me that when our kids went to middle school, lots of moms particularly thought, okay, I'm done. I had to worry about elementary school, but now they're in middle school, everything's fine. That surprised me.
Boy, I would have thought exactly the opposite.
Exactly. Exactly. And candidly, especially when they're in the building for the first time where they've got 5 different teachers and all kinds of other things and activities and everything else that goes on. I remember being in the grocery store one day meeting one of my friends saying, wasn't that a great project that they did connected with such and such? And she had no idea. She hadn't even seen it. Now, I wasn't checking homework at that point, but I was looking over what was going on.
Well, full disclosure, my wife spent 35 years as a public school teacher and has always maintained that 7th and 8th grade are the most difficult times for students. So that's why I commiserate with your situation.
You stay plugged in, absolutely, absolutely, without a doubt. So I knew that a parent's engagement in the child's education made a huge difference. Mm-hmm. So I understood why those charter schools were attractive to families that wanted something better and also successful. And that's a good thing, and I wanted to encourage that. And we actually, during my tenure, we actually loosened up the rules. I got the State Board of Ed to, rewrite the regs to allow high-performing charters to expand without starting from scratch. So if you're operating a school and you're doing well, you can start another school in another location using your same program. Now, I mean, why wouldn't you do that? It's kind of a no-brainer. If you know how to do it, why would I make you start from scratch and take a year and a half to do a proposal and go through all the, if you know how to do it, you know how to do it, and you've proved it. So we loosened that up. We did close some people. We closed some schools that were charters, and we also turned some people down. And I know there were some people that were upset that we weren't approving every application that came to us. Some people thought we should just approve them all. I was especially disturbed by what I saw as charter schools that I thought were beginning to move towards segregation of children. There were communities where people were starting
Racial
schools,
segregation or
ethnic,
cultural?
religious, cultural.
Mm-hmm.
I was very troubled by that. I didn't think that with public dollars, especially in a nation that's growing more diverse and that frankly needs to understand diversity better, that we should be encouraging any kind of segregation. In some cases, it may have resulted in racial segregation by nature of the school, but in some cases, it was an ethnic kind of focus.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if you want your child to do that cultural stuff, do that on your time. They should be in a public school with all the people they're going to live on this earth with. They shouldn't feel like they can be isolated like that. I just thought it was not a smart thing to do.
You mentioned that there was a second area, charter schools.
So the other area was the Interdistrict Public School Choice Program, which had been authorized, I think, early in McGreevy's term or maybe right before it. And that was where a district could say, we have room and we'll take children from other districts into our district. The state provided the funding.
Other municipalities or
Yes.
other areas within the town?
Other municipalities.
Ah.
So I remember one that I can remember off the top of my head, and it was Kenilworth. We used to live near that because Westfield was, near Kenilworth. Kenilworth at the time was an interdistrict school choice district. They had room in some of their buildings, and so they opened the doors basically, and families could choose to send their children. And there were a handful of districts around the state that did that. At the time, the baby boomers' children were in the system, and a lot of these schools were pretty crowded already anyway from all the baby boomers' children. But I think there were districts that were able to do that. And we expanded that program a little bit over the years. It was direct state funding, so it was budget dependent, frankly, because we provided all the money. The money did not follow the child from the home district. So if the child left Westfield to go to Kenilworth, Westfield didn't lose any money. Kenilworth got money directly from the state to educate that child. So those were the two programs. I think that, I think there's a reason to have choice. Again, I would come back to, I don't want it to be for segregation purposes. I also don't want to skim off all the children whose parents are engaged, because those are the parents that help improve schools. In Westfield, one of the reasons the schools were so good was the parents were watching, and when they saw something they weren't sure about, they questioned it. Mm-hmm. And if they saw something they didn't like, they, raised hell about it. And you want parents, you want that side of the equation. You want that piece of the puzzle involved. And parents know a lot about what's going on in those schools too. And if you take out the children whose parents are engaged and you leave only the children who, for whatever reason, mom has 3 jobs, to support the family, or perhaps the mother is sick, or maybe the mom is on drugs, or maybe the mother has died and the child's living with a grandparent who's elderly and who doesn't have the ability to navigate the system. Or in some cases, there were parents who felt that the system had failed them and they didn't want to have anything to do with the system. You can't leave the schools to serve those children. They are as needy. And you need to make sure that you address the needs of all those kids. So my theory has always been, I would like to see charter schools operating inside of school districts. Cliff Janey, when he came to Newark, we brought him in. Governor Corzine hired him in 2008 to be the superintendent in Newark. He was beginning to do that, where he was opening charters inside of the local public school so that they could work together. The regular traditional public school could learn what the charter was doing. They could learn from each other. They could share space. The charter school didn't need facilities then because the facilities were there. You know, as you pull kids out to go to charter schools, spaces open up in the district. Those buildings do not function efficiently if half the children have left for a charter school. So you're much better off letting a charter school operate in there. Cliff had the foresight to see that. That's the kind of thing I'd like to see, is those kind of partnerships, because honestly, at the end of the day, the real hope for me has always been that you improve the education for all children. And the way you do that is to improve opportunities for every child in every school. You can't just say, we'll take some off and we'll put them in a place that's better, or a place that does a better job, or a place that there's a better opportunity. I want those opportunities for all children, no matter where they live.
I think I know the answer to this question that I'm about to ask you. November 2009. The campaign for Governor Corzine, Chris Christie, it's going back. The polls are going back and forth, showing it's going to be a close race. Did you have any expectation that on the day after the election in November of 2009, you would suddenly find yourself in a position where you were probably going to have to go out and get another job or do something other than what you were doing? Or did you anticipate that you were just going to continue plugging along, doing your job, and come what may, que sera, sera?
Well, so interestingly, I didn't expect that I would be kept on. In the next administration.
The next administration, even if it was the Corzine.
Oh, if it was Corzine, it would.
Yeah,
oh
yeah,
my gosh,
right,
yes.
yeah.
But I thought you said the day after the election.
Well, yeah. When you woke up the day after the election and recognized that Governor Corzine had lost.
Right. I didn't have any expectation that I would be asked to stay.
Right.
And candidly, given what I had watched of the campaign, I didn't know that what I was working on was going to gel with maybe what the priorities would be anyway. So I don't know that it would have even made sense. Mm-hmm. You know, Chris Christie and I grew up in the same hometown.
Right.
His mom was actually worked in the board office when my dad was on the Board of Education. But I didn't have that expectation. And I understood. Although I hadn't been involved in politics, I had been observant of politics. And I understood how the world worked. Mm-hmm. I mean, frankly, I didn't have expectations when Governor Corzine was elected the first time that I would stay on. So I certainly had none. We did have things we were still working on, and so we worked to the last day, including filing a Race to the Top application that coincidentally was due the morning of the swearing in of the next governor. We had people who drove it down to Washington that morning. And I didn't pack up until that day. We worked that whole weekend because we had done an application. We thought we had support from the teachers, and it turned out that we didn't have the support, and we had to work really hard. Anyway, it didn't matter because it wasn't going to be our plan going forward anyway. I mean, I didn't even think it made sense. The next administration wanted us to file it, so we did. Mm-hmm. I didn't think it made sense because to me, you have to put forward your vision, and you can't let someone else put forward a vision that they have that then you're going to take. I mean, I remember thinking, wow, if they accept this, if they get this Race to the Top grant, a lot of my work will continue because we built in what we were doing into the Race to the Top grant. Mm-hmm. I think we missed it. We were 11th or something, I think, if I remember.
Well, did you have any communication with so let me just put it this way. How much communication did you have with the Christie transition team about education policy?
So as soon as it was clear that Brett Schundler was going to succeed me, mm-hmm. I immediately called him. We brought him to the department. We wanted him to know what we were doing. And he and I actually met off-site. I think we had a 3-hour breakfast. And I went through, for him, what I thought were going to be his challenges, the pieces that I knew I would be leaving to him that were unfinished, that were still a challenge, that maybe we just realized, we better get on top of this. I tried to give him as best I could because I really wanted him to succeed. to his credit, I think, he carried out the race to the top work that we had done. He kept
Which
several,
cost him his job.
Which cost him his job.
Right.
He kept several of my top team in place, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Those people didn't exit, most of them, until after he left. And I thought there was a glimmer of hope there that the policy would continue. I think we talked earlier about the fact that my observation was that the states that were doing the best for children were the ones where there was sustained policy and a continuous trajectory of implementation. And I thought, here's the best hope. There's a chance here, that the good work that we've done will keep moving forward. Mm-hmm. So I was really encouraged by that.
Well, again, for those folks who are watching this or reading the transcript who are not familiar with what happened, Commissioner Schundler was famously rebuked by the governor after he submitted an application, which the governor did not want to have submitted. They had a big falling out, and he left the cabinet shortly thereafter. So that's the history that followed. So what did you do after January of where are we here?
2010.
2010.
So I slept for about 2 weeks.
I'll bet.
Because I was really tired. And then I started thinking about what would I do next. And then some people started reaching out to me to ask me what was I planning to do next. And, talked about wanting to stay in education policy. I really loved the work that I was doing. And as I said earlier, I think I had a nice network of national folks that I had been working with. The work that we were doing on the standards at the national level and the testing, I really wanted to see that work continue. And Brett Schundler was keeping New Jersey in with the standards. They were sticking with the tests. And so I figured, I'd like to find a way to try to help make that succeed, because that means New Jersey will succeed with that as well. The Hunt Institute, the executive director of the Hunt Institute, reached out to me. That was former North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt.
Oh, yeah.
Had a National Education Policy Institute. It was called the Intersection of Policy and Politics. He understood that good education policy made good politics. And he had, interestingly, I had met him years before, because while I was working on Governor McGreevy's campaign, Governor McGreevy and I went down and spent 48 hours with Governor Hunt while he was still the governor. He was finishing his term. It was in the summer of 2000, so Governor Hunt was finishing his term at the end of 2000. And we spent 2 days with him and his team, and we met with his early childhood. He had a robust early childhood program called Smart Start that he had put in place and that they were funding. We met with his person who was working on juvenile justice and education for children who were incarcerated. We met with the folks who were working on career and tech ed programs. We met with his education, he called it his teacher education advisor. So he had a teacher working in the governor's office, and he had a teacher education panel or whatever. McGreevy eventually formed that. Anyway, we used a lot of what we learned from Governor Hunt. He had focused on standards. He had what he called the ABCs of accountability, and it was really starting to focus districts on continuous improvement and accountability for results and outcomes.
I'm reminded of the time that Governor Kane invited to New Jersey a person whom he considered to be his favorite education governor in the country, a little-known guy from Arkansas named Bill Clinton.
Exactly. Well,
you do learn from these
Hunt
governors.
And Clinton were also very close, because some of their time, I think, had overlapped. Governor Hunt had been governor in the 80s, left for 2 terms, and then came back and did 2 more terms. And it was in his second set of 2 terms, his second set of 4 years, the 8 years, where he really zeroed in on education. But I think then Governor Clinton of Arkansas had helped him in his earlier years. But he had worked with folks around the country, with Lou Gerstner, who was at IBM at the time. They were focused on the preparation of teachers and making sure that we were attracting highly qualified candidates into the profession and then preparing them for success in the classroom to educate the populations they were serving.
So what did you end up doing with the Hunt Institute?
So I became a senior advisor at the Hunt Institute, and I worked on education policy with other organizations, other education organizations around the country, with states. So some of the work that I did was actually going into states that were trying to implement different test systems, getting into PARCC and Smarter Balanced, elevating their standards. When I was the commissioner, we had also raised high school graduation requirements, and a lot of states were looking at doing that, so I was working with states on that. I did a lot around the core curriculum standards, spent a lot of time helping states defend, and this was when all the politics was getting wrapped up, into the standards, helping educators defend, because at the end of the day, it turned out teachers really, really liked these standards. They liked the idea that there was a clear game plan. They liked the idea that they were well thought out, that teachers had given input, that teachers had reviewed them, and they saw the value in that. And so I actually worked with educator groups in some of the states. We sponsored forums. I would bring speakers in to talk about standards. We would bring principals or teachers. In some cases, we brought state legislators together. I worked with the National Conference of State Legislators, or Legislatures, who represented all the legislators in the country, and spoke at many, many meetings for them. I worked with the National Governors Association on initiatives as they were beginning to educate governors and their policy advisors on some of these education policy issues. I helped with a lot of that, spoke at a lot of their meetings. Did a lot of policy research myself just to keep up with, where we were headed.
So you caught up on your sleep pretty quickly, and then
I did, and got right back into it, and then basically just circled the country many, many times. I mean, I did a lot of traveling to help other states. And there were 4 of us that were senior advisors at the Hunt Institute, and we all did that. We worked with other states, and we worked with these partners. And I did that until 2017, actually. The election in 2016 and the change in the department, and kind of what looked like a change in the focus of how education policy at the national level was going. I mean, I think people were beginning to understand where the feds had erred, and they were trying to pull back a little bit, and then places where they were doing some good and really trying to support that. I wasn't a big fan of the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act or whatever. That was the next iteration of No Child Left Behind that everybody was clamoring for, but I wasn't a huge fan of all the parts of it. I thought that I was worried that there was too much opportunity, if the feds weren't on top of it, for states to slide back again. And as it turns out, it was pretty clear that that's what was going to happen. The feds have, I think, decided to take another hands-off approach and to kind of step back and to leave it to the states. And that just, I think, takes us back to pre-2000, like the 90s, when a child's educational experience and opportunity was solely dependent on where they lived, because nobody was there to make sure that all children got those good opportunities and good educational experiences. No Child Left Behind, a lot of people didn't like that it shined a light, but it really did show us as a nation that there were lots of children who were not getting the education that they deserved, that they needed, that this country needed them to get.
Are you comfortable today that in New Jersey, students who have been left behind in generations past have a better opportunity than they used to have because of changes that took place under your tenure?
I think that they do. I think there's still more work to be done. Certainly when I was there, we knew there was a lot of work that still had to be done, but progress has been made. I think having more funding, focusing on early childhood, that early experience really does. It's a game changer. It changes everything else that follows. When a child gets to kindergarten at the starting line instead of 30 feet behind, the child has a much better chance of finishing the race. And so, and I feel even better now because I think the legislature has recognized that they need to go back to having a funding formula that works, that provides equitable resources. There's a huge push by this governor now on early childhood that is really encouraging. And the whole country's woken up to this. There isn't a state in the nation that isn't looking at early childhood, because there's enough research and there's enough evidence that proves that investment is the big thing, that you just reap dividends for children all the way through. And that if you don't do it, it's very, very difficult for anybody to help those children catch up. If you go to kindergarten and no one's ever read a book to you, and you don't know the colors, and you don't know any letters, and you don't know any sounds, and you don't even know what numbers are, you're really far behind. And that really becomes a huge hill for a child to climb, especially a child who comes from a family that doesn't have the resources to help support them, or is in a district that doesn't have the resources to support them the way they need to be. So early childhood that's the place to be, and the country is there as a whole. So I feel good about this on a national level, and I also feel really good about it on a state level, because I think we're headed in the right direction.
One final question that has nothing to do with education. You served under Governor McGreevey, acting governor, well, now because of the law change, he's actually called Governor Cody, Governor Corzine. Can you compare and contrast the management style, the leadership style, the gubernatorial style of each of those three individuals?
I would say all three very different in their own way. I loved working for every one of them. I have to admit, I have worked for people in the past who I didn't really respect or care for. I loved all three of them. And I thought they were all really dedicated public servants. They cared about the citizens of the state. They especially cared about the children. Jim McGreevey came to the table with that education background that made him, I think, uniquely positioned to understand education policy. Governor Cody understood, because of his wife, what the real everyday experience was. Because it's easy when you sit in the ivory tower to say, do this, 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 and this. It's much more difficult because you're not delivering that stuff. It's what happens in every single classroom, in every school building across the state that delivers the policy. And Governor Cody understood that really, really well. Governor Corzine, I think, had a really big vision and understood what the state needed to do to advance, especially from an economic perspective, to continue to be competitive. The one thing that he would always say to me, and I respected this so much, whenever I went to him on anything, whatever policy, whatever decision we were making, he would always say to me, is this what's best for children? And most times I was only there because it was, but he always asked me that question. Or if I went to him with two different options, he would say to me, which one is best for children? And that's the way we would proceed. At one point in time, we did something that was, I think, politically very difficult. We professionalized the county superintendent offices. They had been, in the past, more like paper collectors, and they were kind of political plum jobs. Legislators would recommend somebody for the job or whatever. And when we put the Quality Accountability Continuum in place, QSAC, the evaluation for districts in place, I said to the governor, if we're going to do this and we want to really help districts improve, then we need leadership at the state office level, at the regional, the county office level. The state has to provide leadership in the county for those districts. And the only way to do that is to have someone who's been a highly successful superintendent as the county superintendent who can lead other superintendents. And he agreed with me. He got it. And those people had to be appointed, because we built it into the QSAC law, they had to be appointed at the state level, and they had to go through advice and consent. Mm-hmm. And we had some counties where people wouldn't sign off because they had somebody else they wanted. And they were people who weren't qualified to do the job.
Did you write qualifications into the law as well?
We did not write the qualifications. Well, I don't think we wrote them into the law. They may have been in regulation. But I mean, we had a job description, and we knew it wasn't like we just picked out the people we liked. We wanted people with a track record. And by the way, he interviewed all of them. He personally interviewed them because his neck was on the line. I mean, this was changing a job pretty dramatically.
Did you eventually get 21 qualified people?
We got 21. They were not all. Some of them we wound up putting in as acting because he said to me he was not going to capitulate. He agreed that we needed to have qualified, highly experienced leaders in those positions because of what we were going to ask them to do. I mean, we were putting a lot of weight on their shoulders. We really wanted them to go in and, because the state hadn't been providing that kind of support to districts. We just didn't have the capacity to do that, especially at the county level. And so I gave him a lot of credit, but he always said, is this what's best for children? And I just had utmost respect for that. It was the reason why it was so easy to come to work every single day, despite the challenges, and there were a lot of challenges. There were nights I drove home at 11:30 from some meeting I was at or some hearing I was at, and I would get up and go back in the next morning and be exhausted. But I always felt that he was supporting the work I was doing, that he cared immensely about the work that I was doing. And so I never wanted to disappoint him. I always wanted to deliver on what he was expecting of me and the team that I led. And by the way, I don't take credit for any of the work that we did myself. I did it with a really strong team of people. And I think I talked earlier about, I kept those people who were at the department, and they stuck with me. Most of my senior team was with me the entire time I was there. They were really talented, highly skilled, lifetime education professionals who were, government workers. They cared so much about children, about education, and about the state. And it was because of them having a team like that, that made all the difference in the world. And having their years of experience, I think, also helped us, because it's really easy to come in and say, I'm going to knock everything down and start all over again. But it is really hard to do things right and to do things when you only have a short period of time. 4 years even goes by very, very quickly.
Sure does. Well, this time has gone by quickly as well.
Thank you.
I really thank you for coming in and sharing your thoughts, and I can safely say that your Twitter account is correct. You are an education policy wonk.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.